Every year, billions of people around the world celebrate Christmas on December 25th, but very few know why this exact date was chosen. In this video, you'll discover the real story behind the decision to place the birth of Jesus at the end of December. From the oldest records to theological debates and pagan festivals in ancient Rome, we'll cross centuries of religious tradition, symbolic calculations, and political strategies to understand how December 25th became the heart of the Christian Christmas. No opinions, no modern interpretations, just the facts, told exactly as they happened.
Throughout history, different cultures mark the end of the year with celebrations linked to light, the winter solstice, and religious festivals. Christian Christmas, although now celebrated on December 25, emerged from a complex process involving theological calculations, Jewish traditions, and Roman festivals such as Saturnalia and the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti. These elements were reinterpreted and integrated over centuries to establish the date we know today. In this video, you will follow the entire historical construction that positioned Jesus' birth at the end of December, exploring cultural, religious, and astronomical contexts. Get ready for a narrative faithful to historical records without modern interpretations. Discover the path that led to December 25th becoming the heart of Christian Christmas. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to receive more videos like this.
Gospels of Matthew and Luke. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke are the only ancient documents that record the birth of Jesus. Both are in the New Testament and are considered central sources for Christian tradition. However, neither of them specifies the exact day Jesus was born, not December 25th nor any other calendar date. This absence raises the first major question. If the Bible doesn't define the day, where did the tradition of Christmas on December 25th come from? The Gospel of Matthew narrates Jesus' birth during the reign of Herod the Great. Historical records confirm that Herod died in 4 BCE. This means that if this account is to be considered, Jesus would have been born at least 4 years before our current calendar reckoning. Meanwhile, the Gospel of Luke offers another timeline. It states that Jesus was born during a census ordered by Caesar Augustus when Quirinius was governor of Syria, something that happened around 6 CE. These two accounts directly contradict each other. The 10-year gap between them shows that even the biblical authors worked with distinct memories and traditions. This doesn't mean the birth didn't happen, but it reinforces that later efforts to fix an exact date were not based on textual consensus. Although the birth of Jesus is central to Christianity, it began its history without a defined place on the calendar. In addition to the chronological inconsistency, none of the Gospels offer astronomical, seasonal, or cultural clues to infer the exact date. There's no mention of the weather, star positioning, agricultural season, or any other indicator that would allow us to reconstruct the month, the day. The only temporal elements are political: kings, censuses, governors, but these data don't align with each other, as previously shown. Other early Christian texts also completely ignore the date of birth. Writings like the Proto-Evangelium of James and the Gospel of Pseudo-Thomas, which circulated in the early centuries, describe Jesus' childhood with legendary details, but never mention the day he was born. This reinforces the idea that there was no interest in a specific date among the first Christian communities, even among those eager to know more about the Messiah's origin. During the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, there is no reliable record of Christians celebrating the birth of Jesus on December 25th or on any other date. The concern with the birth seems secondary to the centrality of the death and resurrection. The absence of this celebration in the earliest records will be key to understanding how and why Christmas would later gain a place on the calendar, and why it would eventually be fixed on December 25th. Therefore, since the New Testament itself doesn't define when Jesus was born, we must turn to other historical sources and contexts to understand why this date was chosen. From here, the investigation leaves the biblical texts and begins to follow the cultural, social, and religious trails that influenced the decision. The next step is to understand how early Christians viewed the concept of birthdays and why that is crucial to tracing the origin of Christmas.
Writings of the early church fathers, Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian of Carthage, and Origen of Alexandria. In the early centuries of the Christian era, followers of Jesus showed no interest in celebrating birthdays. Early Christian tradition emphasized spiritual values over personal milestones, and there was no focus on birth dates, not even Christ's. This sharply contrasted with common pagan customs, which included elaborate birthday celebrations for important figures. For the first Christians, such behavior was incompatible with the ideals of the new faith. Church fathers like Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian of Carthage, and Origen of Alexandria wrote extensively on the topic. To them, birthdays were worldly celebrations associated with personal pride and attachment to earthly life. In their writings, they made it clear that only sinners rejoiced on such days, while the saints were expected to reject this kind of vanity. This line of thought greatly influenced early Christian theology. Origen, one of the most respected theologians of early Christianity, even wrote that among all the saints recorded in the Bible, none is found celebrating their birthday. This observation wasn't just a theological note, but a direct critique of Roman customs. He believed the true significance of Christian life lay in how one died, not in how one was born. Therefore, martyrdom dates were honored, while birthdays were dismissed. This view was part of a broader belief system in which birth was seen as the beginning of one's struggle with sin, while death in holiness marked spiritual victory. Because of that, many early Christians honored the day of a martyr's death as their true birthday, oriented toward eternal life. Physical birth, on the other hand, was treated as a common event with no spiritual relevance. This disdain for birthdays helps explain why Jesus' date of birth was neither established nor celebrated during the first 2 centuries. The absence of records about Christmas from that period was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice aligned with the values of that early Christian generation. Their focus remained on the crucifixion and resurrection, not on the nativity or the day it happened. Moreover, in a context of persecution, Christians preferred to focus on aspects that strengthened their spiritual resilience. Public birthday celebrations, especially for religious figures, could be interpreted as vanity or worldliness, something many early believers aimed to avoid. Although Jesus' birth was acknowledged as sacred, it didn't immediately become a symbolic date on the church's calendar. That would only begin to change centuries later, when Christianity was no longer persecuted. Before that transformation, the idea of celebrating Jesus' birth with an annual festival simply didn't exist. For the first 200 years of Christian history, December 25th held no religious meaning. The origin of the Christian Christmas was still far away, and its creation would depend on deep cultural shifts that began to unfold once Christianity moved from a persecuted faith to an accepted or even dominant religion in the Roman world.
During the first 3 centuries of the Christian era, the religion gradually expanded, evolving from small scattered groups into organized communities across various regions of the Roman Empire. Initially, Christians lived under heavy persecution. Gatherings were held in secret, and the faith was practiced discreetly. However, as the message spread, the church's structure began to solidify. Bishops, synods, and theological texts grew in importance. With the growth of Christian communities came the need to standardize rites and beliefs. The variety of local interpretations about Jesus' life and teachings caused internal conflicts. To preserve unity, church leaders began organizing councils and debating core doctrines. This process of institutionalization laid the foundation for a more cohesive and influential church. Christianity was no longer just a spiritual experience, it was becoming a formal religious institution. Relations with the Roman Empire also underwent major changes. Initially hostile, the state began to see Christians as a growing force that needed to be understood. In some regions, persecution gave way to tolerance. In others, discreet alliances were formed with local authorities. This growing proximity between faith and political power would prove crucial in the coming changes, including how religious festivals would be seen and organized. In this context of expansion, Christians began asking how they could engage with Roman culture without losing the essence of their faith. Creating their own commemorative dates became one strategy to establish identity and gain visibility in the public calendar. Holidays like Easter, already celebrated since the early centuries, served as models. Still, the birth of Jesus remained without an official date, but the climate was starting to favor such a change. The absence of a birth date was no longer just a matter of theology or tradition. As Christianity advanced into formerly pagan territories, it became necessary to create symbols strong enough to rival the already popular festivals among the population. Christmas, when it eventually emerged, would have to engage with this cultural landscape, and the month of December, filled with pagan celebrations, would soon become a strategic option. But that choice had not yet been made. Before that could happen, the church still needed to gain more space and recognition. A celebration of Jesus' birth would only make sense in a context where Christ was fully established as the central figure of the faith. This required Christianity not just to be accepted, but to become dominant, something that would begin to take shape in the 4th century with the rise of emperors favorable to the new religion, such as Constantine. This process of institutionalizing the faith, combined with the desire to affirm Christian identity within the Roman world, would open the door to the creation of official holidays. Christmas didn't exist yet, but all the elements that would make it possible were starting to fall into place. The next step is to understand how Roman religious traditions, especially the December festivals, shaped the calendar and prepared the scene for the arrival of December 25th. Cultural and religious practices of ancient Rome. Long before the rise of the Christian Christmas, the month of December already held a special place in the calendar of ancient Rome. It was a period marked by several religious celebrations and public festivals. Among the most well-known was Saturnalia, a feast dedicated to the god Saturn. Celebrated between December 17th and 23rd, it was one of the most anticipated events of the year for Romans. Its popularity crossed social classes and regions of the empire. During Saturnalia, Roman daily life was turned upside down. Social norms were temporarily reversed. Slaves could sit at the table with their masters, wear free citizens' clothing, and even be served. It was a period of symbolic freedom, filled with laughter, food, and games throughout streets and homes. People exchanged gifts, and temples were open to the public. The city transformed into a collective celebration. Another important element was the solar character of December's festivals. In pagan cosmology, the end of the month marked the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year in the northern hemisphere. From that point forward, days began to grow longer again, symbolizing the rebirth of the sun. This astronomical phenomenon carried deep spiritual meaning. Various Roman traditions celebrated the return of light, fertility, and cosmic order. This context gave rise to another influential holiday, the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, or Birthday of the Unconquered Sun. Officially promoted by emperors like Aurelian in the 3rd century, it was associated with the solar deity that could never be defeated by darkness.
The celebration took place exactly on December 25th, with public events, parades, rituals, and tributes to the sun. It was an imperial festival with strong symbolic and political appeal. These celebrations were not fringe events. They were deeply rooted in Roman culture and had official backing. December, therefore, was a time of great religious and social excitement. The Roman people were already accustomed to festive rituals during this time of year. That familiarity would later play a major role in how the Christian calendar would take shape. There was still no mention of Jesus' birth in this context, but when the Church began consolidating its own holidays and seeking a place in the Roman calendar, it inevitably had to deal with the strength of these traditions. The challenge wasn't just theological, it was also cultural and strategic. After all, how could new sacred dates be created in a calendar already filled with ancient, deeply popular meanings? The answer to that question would begin to emerge with the arrival of a new historical figure, Emperor Constantine. With him, Christianity would move from the margins of the empire to become a recognized and protected force. And in this new scenario, the dialogue between pagan festivals and Christian celebrations would become even more complex, especially when the sun and Jesus began to share symbolic space in the month of December.
Records on Saturnalia and historical documents from the Roman calendar.
Saturnalia was more than just a party. It was the main event of December in ancient Rome. Dedicated to the god Saturn, a deity linked to agriculture, abundance, and time, it symbolized the temporary return to the Golden Age, a mythical period of equality and prosperity. Its annual celebration involved the temporary suspension of established order, creating an atmosphere of freedom and reversal of social norms. Held between December 17th and 23rd, Saturnalia began with a sacrifice at the Temple of Saturn, followed by a public feast. Homes were decorated with candles, wreaths, and small figurines. People wore festive hats and even exchanged drawn names for gift-giving, a practice similar to modern-day Secret Santa. Romans set aside formal obligations and immersed themselves in a mood of fun and symbolic disorder. Although it was one of the most beloved festivals among the Roman population, Saturnalia did not extend to December 25th. Most ancient sources place it between the 17th and 23rd, with a few accounts mentioning it could stretch to the 24th in rare cases. But there are no reliable historical records placing Saturnalia on the 25th. This matters because it's often mistakenly believed that Christmas was placed on this date to directly replace Saturnalia. In reality, what Saturnalia offered was a general context of celebration during December. It helped build an atmosphere of festivity, generosity, role reversal, and public gathering. These characteristics, over time, would be repurposed by later Christian traditions, but not in a direct or immediate way. Saturnalia was not transformed into Christmas. It was simply part of the seasonal background into which Christmas would later be introduced. It's important to highlight that Romans already had a calendar full of religious festivals, and as the Church solidified, it had to reckon with these pre-existing dates. Some later Christian leaders may have seen in Saturnalia a reflection of practices incompatible with Christianity, but records show that the selection of December 25th is actually connected to another specific cult, that of the unconquered sun, which was indeed celebrated on that exact day. So, Saturnalia can be seen as one piece of the puzzle, not the centerpiece of the decision. The festive and socially inverted atmosphere it promoted helped the population accept the idea of a Christian holiday in the same month, but technically it is not the direct origin of December 25th. The link between that date and the birth of Jesus lies elsewhere, and that will be revealed in the upcoming parts of the story. From this point on, the narrative draws closer to the figure who would most influence the transformation of the religious calendar, Emperor Constantine. Under his reign, the relationship between the sun, the empire, and Christianity would intensify, and December 25th would take on a new symbolic and political meaning, this time directly connected to the cult of the unconquered sun.
Historical records of the Roman Empire regarding the cult of the unconquered sun.
In the year 274 CE, Emperor Aurelian officially established the cult of the unconquered sun as one of the central religions of the Roman Empire. This solar deity, known as Sol Invictus, symbolized the force that was never defeated by darkness, even during the shortest days of winter. The cult was especially popular among soldiers, merchants, and members of the elite who saw in the sun a symbol of order, renewal, and divine power. Aurelian built a large temple dedicated to Sol Invictus in Rome and promoted the celebration of the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun, within the official imperial calendar. The date chosen was December 25th, shortly after the winter solstice. It was a symbolic moment when daylight began to increase again, marking the return of light. For the Romans, the sun was being reborn, bringing with it hope for fertility and stability in the new cycle. The choice of this date was not random. The winter solstice was observed by many ancient cultures, and its astronomical and symbolic meaning was widely recognized. In the northern hemisphere, the shortest days of the year occur around December 21st. From that point onward, daylight gradually increases, a natural sign of rebirth. December 25th came to be seen as the peak of this phenomenon, and therefore an ideal day to celebrate the birth of a solar deity. Festivities honoring the unconquered sun included chariot races at the Circus Maximus, offerings, processions, and public rituals. The emperor and high-ranking officials took part in these events, which gained increasing importance in the civic calendar. The universal nature of the sun, visible to all peoples, made this cult an attempt at religious unification within the empire. Aurelian viewed Sol Invictus as a deity capable of transcending cultural boundaries and strengthening state cohesion. The cult of the unconquered sun did not exclude other beliefs, but it assumed a privileged position. Its association with imperial power firmly established December 25th as a prominent date. This development matters because when Christianity later began to gain political influence, a major celebration already existed on the same day that would eventually be assigned to Christmas. This coincidence of dates would later become the subject of debate among historians and theologians. At this time, there was still no official connection between the solar cult and the birth of Jesus. Christianity continued to grow, but its doctrine had not yet taken control of the state calendar. Even so, the presence of a major pagan festival on December 25th created an important point of symbolic convergence, especially once Christianity began engaging with existing Roman traditions. The next step in this story comes with the rise of Constantine, the first Roman emperor to openly identify as a Christian. Under his rule, the boundaries between solar worship and the figure of Christ would begin to blur within the empire's symbolic imagination. From that moment on, December 25th would take on new meanings, and the birth of Jesus would start to be considered strategically within this broader context.
Records from Constantine's government and religious transformations in the 4th century.
At the beginning of the 4th century, Emperor Constantine became the most important figure in transforming the relationship between Christianity and the Roman Empire. Until then, the Christian faith had been persecuted at various times, but under Constantine, this situation began to change. After his victory at the Battle at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, which he attributed to the intervention of the Christian God, the emperor openly supported Jesus' followers. This alliance marked a new era in religious history. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious freedom throughout the empire.
From that moment, Christianity ceased to be illegal and began to receive state support. Churches were built, bishops gained political influence, and a Christian faith expanded rapidly. Despite this, the emperor did not completely abandon pagan symbols, especially those related to the sun. On coins and monuments from his time, representations of both Christ and Sol Invictus are visible. This overlap of imagery was intentional. Constantine seemed to seek a symbolic transition between the old beliefs and the new dominant faith. The light of the sun, already seen as a source of life and power, began to be used to represent the figure of Christ. Terms like Son of Justice or Light of the World became associated with Jesus, not only as a spiritual metaphor, but also as a visual element. This fusion helped the population assimilate the new religious values. Christianity was beginning to assume imperial characteristics. Celebrations, rituals, and symbols of the new faith needed to engage with the Roman universe to gain legitimacy. Constantine, as a political strategist, understood the importance of uniting tradition and innovation. By doing so, he created space for solar elements to be incorporated into Christian iconography. The sun and Christ came to occupy the same symbolic field, which would be decisive for the consolidation of liturgical dates. In this context, December 25th already held strong symbolic weight. It was the day of the rebirth of Sol Invictus, still present in the collective memory of the people. By associating Christ with light and victory over darkness, it became easier to justify, both theologically and culturally, that this would also be the day of the Savior's birth. It was not yet an official church decision, but the path was being prepared based on imperial symbolism and integration with ancient Roman traditions. It is important to highlight that even with imperial support, Christianity did not automatically become the official religion of the empire. That would only occur later, under Emperor Theodosius in 380 CE. But under Constantine, the foundations for this change were already laid. Christianity began to occupy the center of public life, and its festivals started to compete with older cults. December 25th, already marked by solar celebrations, was a natural candidate to absorb new meanings. From Constantine's actions, the relationship between state, religion, and calendar began to be reconfigured. The next step is to understand how, in the following centuries, the Christian Church began to organize its own festivals, reinterpret old dates, and introduce celebrations that would consolidate Jesus' birth as a central event, until December 25th officially became Christmas.
As Christianity gained political and social strength, debates arose about the best way to consolidate religious festivals. Some historians suggest that the Church may have sought dates already popular among Romans to associate new Christian meanings. This practice, called Christianization of pagan dates, could have been a strategy to naturally insert the faith into a calendar already familiar to the population. The focus of this adaptation fell on festivals that already had great popular appeal. The Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, celebrated on December 25th, was a perfect example. Although originally dedicated to the unconquered sun, the date represented the victory of light over darkness and the sun's annual rebirth. This symbolism aligned in an abstract way with the Christian concept of birth and life. Beyond the Sun Invictus, other December festivals, such as Saturnalia, contributed to the festive atmosphere. Although they did not fall exactly on the 25th, they reinforced the custom of celebrations and anticipation of festivities during the period. Integrating these traditions into Christianity could facilitate acceptance of the new religion among converted pagans, making the religious calendar more familiar and less disruptive.
It is important to note that, despite the plausibility of this theory, no contemporary records confirm a deliberate decision by the Church to replace pagan cults. 4th century documents mention Christian celebrations, but do not detail the process of choosing the date. Therefore, Christianization remains a hypothesis based on analyzing coincidences and historical contexts. Still, the cultural effect of Christianizing dates is evident in later centuries. Christian festivals began occupying spaces previously reserved for pagan rituals, and familiar symbols such as candles and lights were incorporated into celebrations. This gradual movement contributed to the establishment of important Christian dates, including Christmas, which became increasingly visible at the end of December. December 25th, therefore, stands out not only for its astronomical and social relevance, but also for being part of a context of symbolic appropriation. The idea of using a date already celebrated by the empire could have been seen as an efficient way to consolidate the faith and mark the birth of Jesus meaningfully. However, the lack of formal documentation keeps the matter open. The next step in the narrative will analyze criticisms of this Christianization theory, showing that many scholars question its accuracy and point out that other factors, such as theological calculations, also played a crucial role in choosing December 25th for Christmas.
Critiques by historians and medieval sources, Dionysius Bar Salibi, and contemporary analyses. Although the Christianization theory is widely discussed, many historians question its validity. The main critique is the absence of contemporary records documenting an official church decision to replace pagan festivals with Christmas. There are no councils or decrees indicating this deliberate intention in the first centuries of Christianity. The lack of documentation makes the hypothesis uncertain and open to academic debate. Some medieval sources, like Dionysius Bar Salibi from the 11th century, suggest connections between Saturnalia, Sol Invictus, and Christmas. However, modern scholars point out that these analyses may reflect later interpretations rather than decisions from the time. Dionysius and other authors sought to explain ancient dates within the theological contexts of their own era, which could lead to mistaken conclusions about the original choice of December 25. Another point of criticism is that Saturnalia and other December festivals do not coincide exactly with the 25th. Saturnalia, for example, generally ended on the 23rd or 24th. Therefore, the claim that Christmas was placed on this day to directly replace Saturnalia lacks historical evidence. The coincidence of the festive period is real, but it does not prove a conscious intention by the early church. Furthermore, the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, which indeed occurred on the 25th, does not appear in records as a festival meant to be replaced by Christian celebrations. Its existence only shows that the day already held symbolic and astronomical significance, which could facilitate the adoption of a new festival, but does not indicate that this was the original reason for Christmas. The lack of documented debates regarding the choice of date reinforces the idea that the process of establishing Christmas was gradual. The early church did not record a formal deliberation about the day of Jesus' birth, and the adoption of already popular dates likely occurred incrementally in different regions over centuries. This suggests that multiple cultural, social, and symbolic factors influenced the decision. Thus, while the Christianization theory provides a possible explanation, it cannot be considered the only or definitive one. The selection of December 25th involves historical coincidences, theological interpretations, and cultural contexts that intertwined over time. The debate continues,
but it allows understanding that Christmas emerged within a complex network of factors and influences. The next step will present the second dominant theory, the theological calculation, which proposes that the date of Jesus' birth was determined based on deductions from the date of the crucifixion and Jewish traditions, offering a complementary perspective on the choice of December 25.
Documents of Hippolytus of Rome, Julius Africanus, and St. Augustine.
The calculation theory arises from theological and chronological analysis of key events in Jesus' life. According to some ancient texts, the crucifixion took place on the 14th of Nisan, according to the Jewish calendar. Based on this point, Christian scholars sought to determine a date of conception and birth that maintained symbolic symmetry with Christ's death. This practice was based on the idea that life and death were spiritually connected. Hippolytus of Rome, one of the authors contributing to this analysis, argued that Jesus' conception occurred on the same day as his death. Following this reasoning, if the crucifixion took place on March 25 in the Roman calendar, 9 months later would result in December 25 as an approximate date for his birth. This deduction was not based on precise historical records of the birth, but on theological calculations aiming for coherence and understanding among Christians at the time. Julius Africanus, another Christian scholar, also recorded similar calculation methods. He considered it important to align significant events in Jesus' life with solar and lunar cycles so that the sacred narrative was consistent and comprehensible. The idea was that conception and birth were not arbitrary, but reflected a divine plan intelligible to believers. St. Augustine reinforced this interpretation in his writings, highlighting that linking death and conception symbolized redemption and the union of humanity with Christ from the very beginning. Thus, December 25 did not emerge by coincidence, but through an internal logic connected to Christian theology and the search for meaning within the sacred narrative. This theory explains how the early church could establish a concrete date without relying on pagan festivals. At the same time, it shows that December 25 held symbolic and mathematical relevance, resulting from detailed theological reasoning. Unlike the Christianization theory, the focus here was on the internal chronology of Jesus' life, rather than adapting external practices. Even if these deductions were not universally accepted at the time, they influenced Western Christian tradition in subsequent centuries. The combination of symbolic calculations, Jewish traditions, and theological interpretations contributed to the consolidation of Christmas as a recognized and celebrated date, although it still coexisted with pagan festivals and regional variations. Therefore, the calculation theory offers an internal, theological, and chronological explanation for December 25. It complements the historical and cultural context provided by Roman festivals, showing that the choice of the Christmas date resulted from the interaction between symbolic calculations and existing traditions.
In Jewish tradition, certain important figures were celebrated symbolically, considering that birth and death could occur on the same day. One example is Moses, who, according to some rabbinical texts, was born and died on the 7th day of the month of Adar. This symbolic view of life inspired Christian thinkers to seek significant dates for events in Jesus' life, creating theological coherence that connected birth and death. Ancient studies indicated that some Christians calculated the date of Jesus' conception based on the date of his crucifixion. If his death occurred on March 25th, 9 months later, following symbolic calculations, it would result in December 25th as the birth date.
These calculations were not intended for historical precision, but for theological and symbolic coherence, reflecting an attempt to harmonize central events in Christ's life within the calendar. Hippolytus of Rome, Julius Africanus, and St. Augustine recorded and commented on these calculations in their writings. They viewed mathematics and symbolism as tools for organizing sacred time. By aligning key events such as conception and birth with the crucifixion, a structured and understandable narrative was created for early Christians, reinforcing the religious meaning of each date. The use of symbolic dates also helped differentiate Christian traditions from pagan practices. By choosing December 25th, the Church could establish a Christian celebration that engaged with the cultural memory of Sol Invictus without directly replacing pagan festivals. Thus, theological calculations complemented the cultural context, providing an independent foundation for Christmas. Additionally, the tradition of aligning birth and death reinforced spiritual symbolism. Jesus' life, from conception to crucifixion, gained a sense of a complete cycle, marking significant moments in the religious calendar. This type of reasoning was common among scholars at a time, who sought to make the liturgical calendar consistent and full of meaning. Although Christmas was not yet universally celebrated at this time, these practices laid the groundwork for the date to be recognized in different regions. The combination of theological calculations with the cultural context of the Roman Empire created fertile ground for the gradual adoption of December 25th as a symbolic date for Christ's birth. Therefore, the calculations and Jewish traditions not only symbolically justified December 25th, but also established an internal logic that would guide the development of future Christian celebrations. The historical narrative begins to approach the consolidation of Christmas on its date, preparing the stage for the final explanation of the official choice. Although theological calculation provided a symbolic basis, it faced practical limitations. Converting dates from the Jewish calendar to the Roman calendar was not simple. Differences in month counting, lunar versus solar years, and regional adjustments created room for variation. This complexity made it difficult to establish an exact date for Jesus' birth, especially in different provinces of the empire. Ancient scholars had to decide how to interpret the days and months mentioned in Jewish texts. Choosing March 25th as the date of conception was based on a specific interpretation, but other traditions could result in different dates. Calendar conversion and the need to adjust calculations to the Roman context generated uncertainty, which explained the coexistence of multiple celebration dates. Furthermore, Eastern Christian tradition adopted January 6th as Jesus' birth date. This variation resulted from the use of the Greek calendar and different liturgical interpretations. While the West moved toward December 25th, Eastern communities maintained their own practices. This shows that the choice of date was neither immediate nor uniform, but the product of regional and cultural processes. The desire for birth to symbolically coincide with significant events could influence the decision. Some Western leaders and theologians prioritized association with the winter solstice and the sun's light, while others focused on symmetry with Christ's death. This diversity of criteria explained the existence of multiple calculations, reinforcing that the process of defining Christmas was gradual and complex. Another factor was the limited historical records. The early church did not document deliberations about liturgical dates in detail. What is known comes from later theological commentaries, which interpreted and organized earlier events. Thus, the adoption of December 25th in the West emerged slowly, combining theological calculations, astronomical observations, and local cultural traditions. Even with these difficulties, December 25th became established in the Western tradition as Jesus' birth date. This choice did not eliminate regional variations, but it provided a common reference point, which facilitated liturgical standardization and the development of Christian Christmas as a central holiday. The process reflected adaptation, symbolism, and theological pragmatism. Therefore, the adoption of December 25th resulted from a combination of factors: symbolic calculations, calendar conversion difficulties, regional traditions, and the need for liturgical standardization. This complexity explains why Christmas only became fully consolidated over several centuries, uniting tradition, theology, and Roman culture into a single day of celebration.
Even with the gradual consolidation of December 25th in the Western calendar, various regions maintained their own traditions to celebrate Jesus' birth. In the East, especially, January 6th continued to be observed as Epiphany, or the manifestation of Christ. This variation demonstrated that Christmas standardization was not uniform and that the adoption of dates depended on local traditions and liturgical interpretations. The differences also reflected the diversity of calendars in use. While the West used the Roman calendar, the East predominantly used the Greek calendar, with different month and day counts. This distinction contributed to the same feast being celebrated on different dates, creating a plurality of practices that coexisted during the first centuries of institutionalized Christianity. In some communities, the celebration of the birth and the Epiphany feast were combined, interpreted as two aspects of the same event. January 6th, for example, combined the remembrance of Jesus' birth with the visit of the Magi. In the West, on the other hand, the emphasis shifted to December 25th, symbolically aligning the birth with the winter solstice and the rebirth of light. This coexistence of dates evidenced that the establishment of Christmas on December 25th was not the result of a single decree or immediate imposition. The date gradually consolidated as the Church sought to create a coherent Western liturgical identity without disregarding regional traditions. Eastern community influence remained, keeping alternative celebrations alive. The gradual adoption process was also supported by cultural and political factors. The integration of solar symbols, Roman festivals, and theological calculations allowed the Church to adapt the date in a way that was understood and accepted by the local population. Familiarity with December festivities helped reinforce the legitimacy of December 25th, while other dates, though still celebrated, became less prominent. Over the centuries, liturgical unification progressed, but never completely eliminated regional variations. Eastern Orthodox churches, for example, still celebrate Christmas on January 6th to January 7th, depending on the use of the Julian calendar. This shows that, despite Western consolidation, the history of choosing December 25th was always linked to diverse regional and cultural processes. Therefore, the adoption of December 25th in the West reflects not only theological calculations and cultural symbolism, but also a process of negotiation among diverse traditions. The coexistence of multiple dates illustrates how Christmas was constructed over time, integrating cultural, religious, and political influences until it became the central feast of the Christian calendar.
During the 4th and 5th centuries, December 25th began to consolidate as the main date to celebrate Jesus' birth in the West. The Western Church gradually adopted the date, including it in the liturgical calendar, although celebrations were still not uniform across all regions. This consolidation resulted from a process of religious standardization and cultural adaptation. The growth of Western Christian communities contributed to the date's importance. Bishops and ecclesiastical leaders encouraged the observance of central feasts, promoting Christmas as a liturgical event that brought communities together. December 25th came to be recognized as the symbolic day of Christ's birth, strengthening Christian identity in relation to existing cultural and pagan traditions.
The integration of cultural symbols, such as lights and public celebrations, facilitated the acceptance of Christmas. The Church incorporated elements already familiar to the population, ensuring the feast was appealing and understandable. This process demonstrated that the consolidation of December 25th depended not only on theological calculations, but also on adaptation to popular social and cultural practices. Even with increasing standardization, regional variations persisted. While the West consolidated December 25th, Eastern communities continued celebrating the birth on alternative dates, such as January 6th. This coexistence illustrates that the Christian calendar was under constant negotiation and that definitive unification required time and gradual consensus among different traditions. Moreover, the authority of ecclesiastical leaders helped reinforce the date. Councils and liturgical writings included December 25th as a reference for major celebrations, establishing precedents that would be solidified in subsequent centuries. This gradual centralization allowed Christmas to become an annual feast, widely recognized and celebrated. Therefore, Christmas began to occupy a fixed place in the religious calendar, but always within a context of adaptation and cultural synthesis. The combination of theological calculations, Jewish traditions, and pagan influences culminated in a date that balanced religious symbolism with social familiarity, preparing the ground for the popular celebration we know today. Thus, the consolidation of December 25th in the West reflects a complex historical process involving liturgical standardization, regional negotiations, and cultural integration. This stage completed the path that allowed Christmas to become a central, lasting, and meaningful feast within the Western Christian calendar.
Synthesis and a Christianization and theological calculation theories.
The process of consolidating Christmas on December 25th resulted from the combination of symbolic, theological, and cultural factors. Calculations based on the date of the crucifixion, Jewish traditions regarding birth and death, and observations of the winter solstice created a solid foundation for defining the date. These elements worked together to give religious significance to the day. Additionally, the presence of Roman festivals, such as the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, provided a favorable cultural context. The association with the reborn sun facilitated the integration of Christian symbolism into a society already accustomed to December celebrations. Christmas, therefore, leveraged existing elements without relying solely on arbitrary decisions. The Christianization of pagan dates, although debated, also contributed indirectly. The familiarity of the people with festivals of light and celebrations at the end of December created a receptive atmosphere. Even if the intention to replace old cults is not proven, the overlap of dates allowed Christmas to be accepted and celebrated without major cultural resistance. The theological calculations, in turn, reinforced the internal logic of the celebration. Aligning Jesus' conception and birth with the crucifixion created symbolic coherence. This approach complemented the cultural context, providing a solid theological justification for choosing December 25th. Over time, the Western Church standardized the celebration, making it an annually recognized event throughout much of the empire. Despite the regional variations that persisted, the date acquired central importance in the Christian calendar. This gradual standardization ensured that Christmas became a lasting and unified feast in the West. The convergence of all these factors, calculations, Jewish traditions, Roman festivals, and solar symbolism, allowed December 25th to be established as the official day of Jesus' birth.
The integration of these elements ensured that Christmas was not only a religious date, but also culturally significant for the population. Thus, the choice of December 25th represents the synthesis of theological, cultural, and astronomical influences. Only after centuries of adaptation and negotiation between different traditions was the date consolidated, giving rise to the celebration of Christmas as we know it today, completing the narrative that explains why Jesus' birth is commemorated on this day. The history of Christmas on December 25th is the result of centuries of cultural, religious, and symbolic development. Theological calculations related to Jesus' life and crucifixion, Jewish traditions of significant dates, Roman festivals such as Saturnalia and the cult of the unconquered sun, and astronomical observations intertwined over time. Each of these elements contributed to consolidating the date at the end of December, creating the celebration we know today. The choice of December 25th was neither immediate nor uniform. Different regions maintained alternative practices, such as January 6th, and the standardization of Christmas in the West occurred gradually, with cultural and liturgical adaptation. The combination of tradition, symbolism, and calculations allowed Christmas to be accepted and become a central feast in the Christian calendar. The historical context reveals that establishing this date involved negotiation, interpretation, and integration of diverse traditions. As Christianity consolidated politically, it utilized familiar symbols and calculated dates symbolically, ensuring that the feast was meaningful and understandable for different communities. This historical process explains why December 25th became the center of Christmas. Despite regional variations that persisted for centuries, Christmas was established as the main Christian celebration, bringing together religious, cultural, and astronomical elements. The integration of these factors reinforced the significance of the feast and established the date that remains today, celebrated worldwide as the birth of Jesus. December 25th, therefore, is more than just a date. It's the convergence point of theological calculations, Jewish traditions, Roman festivals, and solstice observations. This historical synthesis ensures that the celebration has deep religious meaning, while also engaging with ancient cultural traditions and popular practices developed over time. Understanding the history of Christmas on December 25th allows us to appreciate the complexity of its formation, highlighting the interaction between religion, culture, and astronomy. The result is a date that has endured through centuries, resisted differing interpretations, and established itself as a central landmark of the Western Christian calendar. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and activate the bell to receive more videos like this.